All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's panel on Bitcoin mining in El Salvador. So I think for anyone who's obviously already in this country to learn about Bitcoin's adoption curve here, I hope that today's conversation, it's a fireside chat, so let's pretend that there's a nice fireplace behind us, not a blue screen, but it's a fireside chat with Josue Lopez. We're going to learn a little bit about why Bitcoin mining is such an important mechanism, such an important industry at large, but specifically here in El Salvador. So we're also going to give some time towards the end, and we have about 30 minutes together. So we're going to make sure to have some time for questions, for Josue, for myself. But let's begin a little bit by learning a little bit about your background, Josue. Could you give us a little bit on who you are, how you became involved ultimately in the mining industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Josue Lopez. I'm original Salvadoran. I'm based mostly in Switzerland, in Geneva. Now I'm moving to Lugano to be the honorary consul of the embassy of the Chamber of Commerce of El Salvador in Switzerland. Really, where it all started is that right after college, I was looking for this sort of breakthrough, the thing that would take my time off and maybe the thing that I could focus on to help humanity to learn more about technologies and mainly emerging technologies. So I started in private equity in 2018. And my private equity firm in Geneva, Switzerland, they focused on investing in disruptive technologies. These were usually, very traditional finance sort of investments. We would acquire companies on series, on fundraising series. And that's where we really started noticing all these little hiccups with the current financial system, the traditional financial system. The fact that we would make, a couple, $20 million transactions and that those would be charged 4%, 5% on commission, it just seemed wrong to me. There had to be another way. And that way couldn't be just carry $20 million in cash on a private plane and go acquire equity in a company, right? So that's really the first time I used Bitcoin. It was for a transaction. We were acquiring a fintech company out of San Francisco. And we decided, what the hell, we'll buy Bitcoin, transact the Bitcoin, and then, in the end, we'll own a company. So that's where it all started. Then in 2019, we came up with a plan to launch the largest renewable Bitcoin mine out of the Nordics. So the reason we chose the Nordics, first of all, it's because Switzerland is quite close to the Nordics, so it was only a 7-8 hour trip all the way to Mo i Rana, which is in the northern part of Norway. And they had extremely cheap energy prices, and it was fully green. It was completely renewable. We were experiencing prices of $30 per megawatt, which is, at least at the time, it was extremely, extremely well. It's extremely good. And the thing that most attracted me was that it was completely renewable. This was all hydroelectric energy. So that's when we started. We then expanded to Finland, Sweden, and we eventually became the largest mine in all of Europe, and arguably the largest green mine in the entire world. So that said, why are we here? Why did I come to El Salvador when obviously we're mining with great profitability in the Nordics? Why didn't we just expand that market as much as we could? And the real reason, many people on my Twitter seem to argue that I'm only in El Salvador mining because I'm a Salvadoran. And while that may be 80% of the case, I would say that 20% of the argument is that it's actually profitable. You can actually mine Bitcoin here in a profitable way by using a lot of opportunities that we will discuss further along this conversation. So throughout my career, I had it as my objective to benefit El Salvador in any way that I could. Whether it was private equity, acquiring companies in El Salvador, we have since acquired, a ton of companies with a very diversified and high-yielding portfolio. And I always firmly believe that the emerging economies have a great opportunity and are able to generate outstanding yield, not just in Bitcoin mining, but in any industry that you may find. So for the last couple of months, my team and I focused our shift from European mines and what we call developed mines, and that these obviously benefit from cheap prices and very stable grids, and we started focusing more on emerging economies. These economies that don't have these opportunities, but have very interesting characteristics that you can actually take advantage of to produce profitable Bitcoin. So one of the things that you have to know about me is that I will never mine one Bitcoin that is non-green. I think that anything that is mined using fossil fuels is completely shit. It's completely useless, and the reason behind Bitcoin is to make a more sustainable world, a freer world, and therefore we are not, I got offered PPA agreements in Texas for $18 a megawatt. I never took them, even though it was what made financial sense. So we came here to El Salvador and we started with this model of vertical integration. We wanted to produce the energy that we were going to consume. So that said, that's how we really started our involvement here in El Salvador.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. Well, thank you. And first of all, I think it's important and interesting to acknowledge, you know, Salvadoran presence in the industry in the country, right? I think, and here in the audience we have folks from within the mining industry. I think as many of you might know, the power centers in the industry are in the United States, and abroad in China and other continents and countries. But I think it is very, very important that there be Salvadoran-led businesses that are exploring opportunities for energy development and mining business opportunities as well. So it's a really interesting background that you have. And for me personally, just to share a little bit of my own kind of professional background and how it intersects with mining, similar to Josue, my background first was my professional background was in capital markets. I didn't come to Bitcoin from the technical side. I mean, I like to say I can't write a single line of code. I wish I could, because I think I probably would have understood Bitcoin far sooner than I actually did. But I started a small mining business that's focused in North America. And similar to Josue, I think we both share a deep passion for advancing the mining industry at large, right? Just like every other mining industry player in this room. We're all on the same team. We're rowing in the same direction. But I think also one of the things that we see here is the opportunity to really benefit El Salvador's people through the development of energy infrastructure, right? And energy production for a country that really has quite an expensive cost of energy for the normal local or whether you're an individual or a business, right? There's a high cost to energy here, to electricity in El Salvador, and El Salvador is largely a net importer of energy, right? For a certain portion of the year, they actually have to buy their energy from other countries. So these are problems that we believe, and I think folks in the mining industry generally believe, that Bitcoin mining can help, to resolve. So I want to, with that said, I want to kind of ask Josue if he can give us a little bit of background, a little bit more specific information on exactly what kind of energy sources you're using in El Salvador and why you've gone that path.
Right, yeah, so just to cut it straight, if you want to mine Bitcoin in El Salvador, you cannot do it using the grid. The grid is extremely expensive. You'll probably get rates of $160 to $190 per megawatt, which is completely unfeasible. Not just in the current market conditions, but even 2 months ago or a month ago, before the whole FTX shit show, Bitcoin was still buying energy at maybe at $120, $130 per megawatt. So it's completely unfeasible to use the grid. The grid is also extremely unstable. So we set it up as our mission to try to generate our own electricity through the installation of photovoltaic plants. So we have our pilot project is in Chalatenango in the municipality of Nueva Concepcion, where we have designed a 6 megawatt solar plant. We're currently on stage 1, which is 500 kilowatts. This is completely immersion cooled without the use of any other energy, and obviously to stabilize the solar curve, we're using either biomass generators or briefly connecting to the grid, but not in a sense that it would damage our profitability. Now, there are the whole scope of the Chalatenango project, the photovoltaic project, is just to show people that it works. You know, it doesn't require insane amounts of investment. It's extremely profitable. It has an ROI of about 2 years. So it's, you know, pretty in line with what you might find in utility scale mining. But in the end, you know, what we want to do is eventually move to a more stable 24/7 source of energy, or obviously a renewable source of energy, and be able to donate this power plant in Chalatenango to the people there that for years now, for 30, 40 years, have had no access to energy. And, you know, this might seem as a bit of a, you know, kind of unbelievable fact, but they actually don't have energy. They read their books, the kids, whenever they come back from school and have to do their homework, they light candles and matches, and that's how they do their homework.
And if I can kind of make a parenthesis here, the site or the location of the site that Josue is talking about is in Chalatenango, which is actually, and I don't know if you got an opportunity to hear the kind of keynote this morning. I spoke a little bit about my wife's grandfather, who was murdered, you know, close to his family. This was in Chalatenango, right? So this, a handful of months ago, couple of months ago, my wife's family, and of course they included me and my children, we went to Chalatenango to visit the home that my wife's grandfather was taken from and murdered in, and it, to this day, in 2022, doesn't have electricity in it, right? So to me, and I hope to the people of El Salvador, this type of energy infrastructure through Bitcoin mining resonates, right? Hopefully it means something, right? Because right now, you know, 20 years after this man was murdered, you know, in this town that was, you know, effectively without energy, they are still in the same circumstance, and it's very difficult to find anyone who would commit capital to bring electricity to that community, right? This is where Bitcoin miners, the Bitcoin mining industry, can make a difference. So, sorry, I just wanted to kind of give that parenthesis.
But I think you hit the nail. It's really more of the Chalatenango plant is really more of a social project, and that's how I would like people to take it. It is profitable, it is financially viable, but it's just to show that it can be done while still benefiting the wide majority of the impoverished population. Now, going on other things that we're doing in the country, we are working with local companies developing hydroelectric plants. And what we're really doing here is that we're bringing the expertise that we gained in the Nordics through the development of more than 44 megawatts of hydroelectric energy, which up there, they cost us about $700,000 to generate 1 megawatt of electricity. Here in El Salvador, historically, we have paid an average of $6,000 to $7,000 per megawatt, $7 million per megawatt of electricity generated. That is 10 times higher than in the Nordics. And you might attribute this to the corruption of the previous governments, or just borderline inefficiencies in the construction of these. But either way, we're trying to help them get these new technologies, get these new processes, and be able to build out these energy generation plants at a cheaper level, and hence reducing the LCOE of that energy, and obviously benefiting the entire population at the same time. So that said, we're also not the only company that's doing this. Obviously, we were probably the one that acted quickest. I am Salvadoran. I had a lot of input on the Bitcoin law. So it only made sense that we would move to El Salvador and try to develop these technologies here. But I have spoken to I can tell you a lot of our investors, our shareholders, a lot of colleagues in the mining industry, and I'm not talking about the home miners, I'm talking about the big ones, the utility scale miners. And they have shown, a lot of them have visited El Salvador, a lot of them are looking closely at our project. Obviously, if we succeed, we all succeed. They will come here, they will invest in energy. So I think you have a lot to add to that as well, Gerson.
Yeah. it's interesting. You mentioned something, and you alluded to it at the beginning. I think there's a natural embedded kind of trust that you and someone like I have in this country, because our families are from here, because you were raised here, you were educated here. But that's not necessarily the case, I think, for anyone else who literally just heard about El Salvador last year, right? And in particular, for the players in the mining industry, right, who are fat and happy, whatever. They're nicely comfortable in their cheap, electrical grid, communities, or who have access to very cheap and consistent energy elsewhere in the world. For those folks, and in particular folks in the mining industry, getting acquainted with El Salvador is a lot of work. It's a lot of exposure, visiting. I can tell you, I've had the benefit of coming down here with utility scale miners to get to know this country, to experience it for themselves, to see what it is and what it isn't, right? Because there's so much reputational damage that's been done over decades. And I think that's a big part of the equation here, right? Is starting with folks who are from this country who have a vested interest in investing in it, but also then bringing along the mining industry so that we can dissipate and do away with a lot of the misconception about El Salvador. Granted, a lot is changing, as you mentioned. I think due to maybe inefficiencies or incapacity to effectively run, utilities and things in this country. Things have not been done very well in the past, and today we're looking at a completely different, political and regulatory opportunity here in El Salvador.
Yeah, and just to add up to that, on all my conversations with utility scale miners, usually up in Texas, that use fossil fuels at $12 to $18 a megawatt to generate Bitcoin. I always tell them, you will end up in an emerging economy. You will end up trying to vertically integrate downwards to produce your own renewable energy. But, after all, that will happen. They will see for themselves. And I think there's this really cool Max Kaiser quote from Lugano, which is that bees don't spend time showing... what was the... Bees don't spend too much time telling flies that honey tastes better than shit. And they will eventually realize that El Salvador is the land of honey. We're the land of volcanoes. Here is where you can tap all of that potential. And with that said, I wanted to dive into some of the advantages that we identified in El Salvador. So the first one is the political stability of the country. And honestly, even now when I'm saying it, it feels so surreal, because we're a country with historically poor political stability. This was the country where, the government could give you a contract for 6 months and then the next day just take it away from you. Now those contracts are being held up. We have signed PPA agreements for 3 to 5 years. Those are still holding up. 2 years from now, there has been no political instability that we have found. Moreover, there has been a lot of political support. The government has been very supportive, and all of the public entities have come with us to join us on our scouts for renewable energies, on our whenever we go looking for a river, for a hydroelectric plant. These companies come with us and they help us, because they know that if we grow, they grow as well. We all grow together.
And I would add that oftentimes in conversations with North American mining companies in particular, I think the perception, rightfully, is changing from one of seeing El Salvador as as a place with political risk to a place with political opportunity, right? For the entity or people, seeking to enter the space or geographically diversify, which I think is one of the other important advantages.
It's right, the next one, which I think it's in the benefit of the entire Bitcoin network that our hash rate is decentralized. The fact that there's a huge centralization of hash rate in the US and that most of it is produced by burning fossil fuels, it's a huge attack. We may not realize it now, but eventually it will happen. All of these, we were discussing this just before this panel, the US will either nationalize Bitcoin mining or completely ban it and ban a big portion of the hash rate, that will seriously weaken the strength of our decentralized, loving Bitcoin network. So it's really in everyone's interest, everyone that has bought a Bitcoin, everyone that wants to buy a Bitcoin, everyone that transacts with Bitcoin, it's in their interest that this hash rate is more decentralized, that it steers away from, you know, the American overlords and the big brothers out there. So this is in part what we're trying to do with in Latin America, obviously starting with El Salvador, but we have also great initiatives in Ecuador for Bitcoin mining, some in Uruguay, some in Paraguay. You know, we're trying to just ship out miners everywhere in the world that we can, just so that no one can actually control them. And that is really what I think is a great opportunity for mining here in El Salvador. El Salvador will never ban Bitcoin mining.
And I think this is an important point. That sounds maybe bombastic, depending on where you are in your Bitcoin journey and in your familiarity with El Salvador. Hearing statements like this might seem like, what are you talking about? But think about the steps that this country has taken, the ones that we're here to celebrate and talk about, right? Think about the steps that this country has taken from a legal and regulatory perspective, you know, to support the Bitcoin network, right? So I think we are very confident, you know, that the administration is going to be supportive, you know, of energy infrastructure investment and, you know, the Bitcoin mining industry at large. So for those in the mining space looking to geographically diversify so that you don't find yourself in an FTX type situation where all your miners are in a country where they're being confiscated or where you can't touch them anymore, this is yet another reason why I think exploring and getting familiar with and making investments in El Salvador in the Bitcoin mining space is so important and wise.
Yeah. So to jump to another point, what are the opportunities? Where does Bitcoin mining in El Salvador go to from here? What are we going to do in the next couple of years? So as I mentioned before, we focused on solar. I think it's the easy, you know, it's probably the cheapest and easiest form of energy to actually deploy. It is relatively cheap, low capex to deploy. Obviously, there is no operating expense. So once you install it, it's, you know, it's pretty much down to how many years that panel will last. So solar irradiation in El Salvador is about 5.3 kilowatt hours per meter squared per day, which is really good. For those who don't know, that is pretty good. It's above average. And it is enough for you to find enough places to install solar panels so that you can generate electricity, either sell it to the grid or either self-consume it as us. Then one that I, you know, unfortunately El Salvador isn't blessed with the rivers that you might find in South America. So hydroelectric potential is very limited. Most of the rivers that we have that have hydroelectric potential, they were already developed. However, there are some mini hydros that we are developing as we speak in El Salvador, but I'll definitely keep you updated on that one. Now, the biggest one, and I think the one that we're all here for, or most of us are here for, is that obviously El Salvador is the land of volcanoes. We have 20 active volcanoes. There is really no direct number on how many actual volcanoes El Salvador has, but it might range from 77 volcanoes to 160 volcanoes, making us the second most densely populated country with volcanoes. That means that we have outstanding geothermal reservoirs. All of these geothermal reservoirs have been untapped in the past because, you know, they're usually not easy to access. You would have to go, you know, 500 kilometers east, tap a geothermal reservoir, and then have to build power lines back to the city. That is very expensive. But Bitcoin mining, you can mine right next to the geothermal reservoir. In fact, we're doing it right now in Ahuachapan as we speak. So El Salvador has really good geothermal developments. Already developed, there are about 3 plants producing about 350 megawatts of energy, or about 20% of the country's demand. Those are 3. We have 20 active and 77 to 160 available. There is enough geothermal potential to power the entire Bitcoin network forever. And I think that is, you know, something that we will ideally achieve. Obviously, we need a lot of private investment from the outside. We need smart mines, the type of mines that go into Bitcoin. We need those to come to El Salvador and help us build this new country, this land of volcanoes that is now the land of volcanoes and Bitcoin.
Absolutely. And so I think since we're running a little bit short on time, I want to maybe end and then end on a particular note, and then give some time for a couple of questions from the audience. I just want to kind of highlight what he was just talking about, this notion of bringing energy infrastructure to parts of the country that potentially have, geothermally active, geothermal activity beneath the surface, or reservoirs that can be tapped. This represents, I don't want you to think about it in terms of Bitcoin mining terms. Think about it in terms of like human flourishing. What happens when you untap, so much potential energy for human flourishing, right? Bitcoin mining happens to be the industry that can bring forth the energy, right, to the surface and for utility. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this is about human flourishing here in this country. And so El Salvador, a country that's like 1/35 the size of Texas and has a GDP of 160, like a 60th, a GDP of Texas alone, has taken, these enormous steps, right? Or is in the process of taking these enormous steps as they relate, to the Bitcoin network, and now with respect to the mining industry as well. So we want to leave you with hopefully a sense of hope and optimism about what's to come in this country through the Bitcoin mining efforts that are being put forth through people like Josue. So Josue, I want to thank you for your time and for your expertise and for sharing what you did. And I think we have maybe 3 minutes for, let's do 2 or 3 questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, about the mining and energy topic, I have one question and one remark. The remark is that tomorrow I'm giving a speech about energy compared with Bitcoin and banking industry. That could interest you. So I published a paper about energy efficiency of banking compared to energy efficiency of Bitcoin alone. I invite you to come to the conference.
Awesome.
I'll see you there.
Yeah, the answer is Bitcoin is more energy efficient than the East. So
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler.
there are much more juicy details about banking. So come. The question is the following. I start seeing that the energy industry is starting to accept, adopt a little bit by little Bitcoin mining. Can we see, do you think that the energy industry can come in a clash with the banking industry, philosophically, economically, in a way or another? To adopt Bitcoin, support Bitcoin against what the BIS and try to do with central bank digital currencies, ban Bitcoin, ban mining. I come from France, so we succeeded in stopping the ban of proof of work and the MiCA regulation. So what's your take on energy industry versus banking industry?
Well, I think once we dive into what proof of work actually is, we realize that it's really the only way that we can have a pure banking system. Now, you can be sure, and it's already been being done. Like, as I mentioned, we have a lot of mines in the Nordics. So the banking association in the Nordics already tried to ban proof of work. They're trying heavily to influence CBDCs in the Nordics. They will try. Whether they'll succeed, it's dependent on us. That's why I think it's so important that we decentralize the hash rate. Because they might succeed in Norway, they might succeed in Kazakhstan, China, banning proof of work. But they probably won't succeed in these countries, the countries that actually have some self-sovereignty, like El Salvador now with Bitcoin. We don't owe anything to the US anymore.
Yeah, and I would add countries that have and are choosing, and going down the path of economic sovereignty through Bitcoin adoption, at large, and then also leverage that mindset and that bent when it comes to their energy production as well. So we're confident that El Salvador is going to take these steps and become independent of these forces that otherwise would try to undo what's being done in the country. Thank you for your question. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you grapple with the fact that you're not a proponent from mining Bitcoin with fossil fuel energy, but you do talk about generating electricity with a photovoltaic panel that is a product of oil and gas? Do you grapple with that at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of arguments regarding whether renewable energies are actually renewable when they clearly come from, the uses of, the emission is. Yeah, exactly. You don't see it, and the fact that you don't see it also brings the question that, it happens once to produce the panel, but then for your operations, from here to 30 years from now, you really don't emit anything. whether as fossil fuels, okay, you might clearly damage the environment when producing natural gas generators or fossil fuel generators, but you will continue to burn that fuel for 30 years on the lifetime value of your plant. However, with photovoltaic plants, there is a really nice argument that, you know, you damage the environment once, and even I can't argue against that. You know, when you produce a panel, it is damaging to the environment. When you produce an electric vehicle, lithium mines are extremely damaging to the environment. But there is a trade-off on the amount of non-damage that you'll do to the environment on the entire lifetime of whatever the product is. So in this case, solar panels, they last about 25 to 30 years. For 25 to 30 years, all of those kilowatts produced with that panel won't be produced by emitting methane, by emitting CO2, by emitting some sort of dangerous gas that will eventually destroy us all. You know, I think in the long run, it is probably the safest choice. But I really appreciate the question. I think it's a very good topic of discussion.
Right, and an ongoing topic. You know, in the mining industry, these are healthy conversations to always have.
Absolutely.
We have time for one last question. So, oh, right there. Sorry.
So that's a great question. So right now we're in the process of examining how many geothermal reservoirs have actually been found. Because, you know, in the previous years, we really didn't have a big demand for cheap energy. El Salvador was mostly good with the energy prices that we had, so there was really no breakthrough in trying to find geothermal reservoirs. But now there is a big push. Incredible props to this company, the Salvadoran company called Lageo. In my opinion, it's probably the most efficiently managed company here. And it's the company that has developed all of the geothermal production of El Salvador. It's a public company. And I think they are doing a tremendous job with finding new reservoirs, doing prefactability studies on those, maybe even drilling in the next couple of years, some of those. But what I focus on is mostly the private involvement on trying to find those, you know. For example, I was talking with some of the big miners in Iceland, and obviously they use geothermal energy for their development. So we want to bring those. We want to bring you. You know, you're a volcanologist. We need you here in El Salvador to help us find better geothermal reservoirs, find easy to access reservoirs, so that we can actually start producing energy not 20 years from now, but hopefully 2 or 3 years from now.
Agreed. And also, I would add just one more thing to that. Beyond or along with someone like yours expertise on the matter at hand, I think being a voice from El Salvador that can speak with authority on these topics of volcanology here, I think you're also an important voice in the mining. It can be an important voice within the mining industry globally, right? Because as we talked about a little bit earlier, there is very, very little understanding. We're so early in the process of helping the rest of the world understand what exactly is happening here, right? So I think there's plenty of opportunity for yourself, and I think a lot of folks who are in a university like Mario and so many others. There's a really bright future, I think, for young folks, engineers and professionals in this realm, inside of your country, but also inside of this bigger global industry called Bitcoin mining. So I think with that, we're a little bit over on time. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time and attention.
Thank you.